Hi, welcome to my talk titled Retrospective Clinical Data Harmonization Reporting. I am Jeremy, a research officer from the National Heart Centre Singapore, and my main job is to collect, clean, and harmonize clinical data. In this talk, I'll present an overview of data harmonization, some tips to counter small but annoying problems during the process, and I will provide some suggested workflows to create reports and diagrams for different clients. Data harmonization is part of the data cleaning process where similar variables across different data sets are identified, grouped based on a generalized concept, and transformed into unified harmonized variables for analysis. So here is an example of a data harmonization workflow where I first liaise with the collaborators on what variables I need and provide them with a data dictionary and input template file in Microsoft Excel. After receiving the data, I will then proceed to data cleaning and harmonization and send the data to the analysis team for further analysis. Occasionally, I may need to return the harmonized data set to the collaborator and provide a report on what I've done with their data set. Things, however, do not go according to plan. Most of our collaborators do not have the resources to match their data to the provided data dictionary and input template file, so they just send the data in their own way they like. As a result, the data provided may have issues that requires relevant experience to identify or may be so hard to solve that conventional methods do not always work. I honestly believe that a data harmonization report is important because I am the middleman between the collaborator and the analysis team. Everyone is watching me, even though it is a challenging task that nobody wants to do. Collaborators also want transparency on how the data is processed, and if anything goes wrong with the data, I will be the first one to be consulted, and a decent report is going to save me from a lot of trouble. When I try to search on the web on how to do data harmonization, most of them just give a brief overview on how it should be done. There are no examples of how to create a data report in any programming language. It is just hard to know where to start. During my search, I managed to find some R packages that do data harmonization. They are retro-harmonized, harmonized, and PS-harmonized. However, there are some limitations. Retro-harmonized work with categorical, but not so much with continuous data variables. Harmonized documentation has too much jargon and it's difficult for me to understand. While PS Harmonize present the report in Microsoft Excel, this method only works if the harmonization process is simple. If the process is complicated, having the report presented in Microsoft Excel can be hard to read. After spending a few years on the job, I managed to create my own R project template to create decent harmonization reports. So this is how it looks like. And you can see that the layout of the files and the README is inspired by the R package, R compendium. And here are the links to the reports. So this is how it looks like in HTML. And here is how it looks like in PDF. So for the file structure, I put all my data in the data raw folder. For the codes for our scripts and Quarto scripts, I put inside the code folder. And for the report results, reports, I put them in this reports folder. I will now share some common issues faced when doing data harmonization. Collaborators may send different versions of the same data, and the first one may be okay, but subsequent versions may have issues. So here is an example where we read the file in CSV using Group's package. And you can see that the H column should have been read using text instead of integer. If you were to want to code from 1 to 11, there will actually be no errors or warnings, and the warning will only come out when you call a function such as hate. So I was thinking whether there's an automated way to catch these issues. Well, the Group's package has the function problems that will give out a table with at least one row if there are issues. So I can just use the expect row count match function from the point bank package to check for this issue. So here's a situation where there are no errors, and as you can see, the number of rows is 0 and the code runs without any errors. Now that I've done it for CSV files, can I do the same for Excel? Well, we can wrap the code by this function called expect no conditions from the tested package. However, this means that you will lose the pipeline workflow. And if you need to use this function multiple times, your code could be pretty messy. So to rectify this issue, I actually use the T-pipe operator from the Magritte's package. So on the left, you can see is the case when there are issues, and when there are no issues, you can still continue your pipelines. So now I will show my variable mapping reporting workflow, where I first tell the readers how I'm going to map the data. The codes, I'll then show the codes to do the mapping and validation. I will provide some examples that the code works. And finally, I will do a cleanup to ensure that the harmonized variables can merge together. So let us take this data set example that I've created. And in this presentation, I will focus more on the smoke history column. So this is how I show the readers how the smoke history column is going to be mapped. Next, here are the codes that will do the mapping, starting with selecting the patient ID and the smoke history column. And here's how I do the mapping. And these are the codes that I do for the validation. So the first part is to check whether I only have 0, 1 or -1 for my harmonized variables. And then subsequent codes is to ensure that these two variables, smoke current and smoke path, share this unique relationship. The next part of the documentation is to show my collaborators the code actually works. So here's an example of how I do it in HTML, where I wrote a custom function that creates an interactive tables for my collaborators to check. In the case of PDF files, I'll use the distinct function from the dplyers package to show the different cases in the data. Lastly, I remove the collaborators column smoke history to prepare the data for merging. So suppose we have completed harmonizing a batch of clinical data, we want to merge them together without issues of missing rows or additional columns. For me, I first have the data with just the patient ID, and then I merge the data with the inner join function from the dplyers package with some additional parameters. So one of them is the unmatched set to error, and this will ensure that we have avoid patients with no matches. So on the right, you can see that we have a mismatch of 4 in the Y here, and an error is shown. Subsequently, in this example, we have a mismatch of 2 here, and an error is also shown. To avoid patients with multiple matches, I set the relationship parameters to 1 to 1. So in the example on the right, there are multiple matches of 2, and an error is produced. I also use the function has column from the point blanks package to show that we only have the harmonized variables. So you see an example on the right, we have a duplicate variables of island, and we were to merge them together, we're going to have a column with ends with .x and .y. And we can set the conditions for has column to check for this case. And then we just wrap the function with a test that to ensure that the code will only run and proceed if these conditions is satisfied. I can add additional checks such as the number of columns to be 9 or to be even more stricter to have these names as my harmonized variables. I will now touch on the challenges of report generation for data harmonization. We can see in the previous slide that one variable mapping will take at least 1 page for a simple one. And if, on average, for research, a study or clinical trial, we could have a few hundred variables, and this means that your harmonization report can have at least a few hundred pages for each cohort. And so there's really a need to automate this process. In addition, collaborators may want different ways on how the report should be how the data harmonization report should be presented. And I find the documentation from DVO very useful in achieving this. So from the earlier example that you see, we can put them under the reference category. In the case when you need to write a workflow as a supplementary document for a journal paper, perhaps the how-to guides will be a better approach. To create technical reports automatically, we first have to take a look at how to make Quarto books. So there are two key files that you need. Firstly, the Quarto YAML file and the index.qmd file. The Quarto YAML file controls the contents of the book, while the index.qmd file is actually the free place of the book, which is compulsory in creating the Quarto books. So I first create the index.qmd file for technical report generation. Next, for each cohort, I create a corresponding Quarto YAML file, and here are the Quarto scripts for each cohort. I then create an automated script to create the technical report, firstly by first copying the index.qmd files to the project folder and rename it accordingly. Then I create a function that first copies the quarto.yaml file for each cohort into the project folder and rename it accordingly. Next, I render it into a Quarto book, and I use the work function from the Programs package to run this for each cohort. So this is how it looks like for in the output in PDF, doc, and HTML for cohort B. So a similar method can be used for the how-to guide as well. This time, I have created a summary report in Word using the R package flex table. Here is an example of a justification report explaining why I use smoke current and smoke pass. So initially we have this column called smoke history, which has 0 for non-smoker, 1 for current, 2 for pass, and -1 for unknown or missing. However, in the early stage of the project, our collaborators could only provide information if the patient has a smoking history or not. So if the patient has a smoking history, we don't know where to put them as 1 or 2. So instead, we create these columns and that holds the value 1 for yes, 0 for no, and -1 for unknown, and change the smoke history columns to hold the same thing. And this red part is actually our compromise solution. Management may also want an update of your data harmonization process by asking questions like, how many variables can each cohort provide? How many variables can be harmonized? At first, I tried to plot a Venn diagram, but it did not work with many cohorts. I then tried to present an upset plot, but such plots are too complicated for clinicians who only see them once every 6 months when I present the results. They will inform me things like I forget what the black dot means and complains that the diagram is too complicated. Such plot also cannot answer follow-up questions such as how many cohorts provide patients' blood lipid information and how many patients have this information. After multiple rounds of attempts, I've managed to come up with this heat map where it shows the cohorts, number of patients that they have, and number of variables they're able to provide. And for each of the variables, I classify them by different colors, such as the purple for comorbidities and orange for the blood lipid information. I also indicate in the table's legends that the table contains the tick and cross if the data is provided or not, or even the gray shading to show that the data is pending arrival. So in my talk, I've covered a brief introduction of what data harmonization is, my data harmonization reporting workflow, ways to create the reports automatically, and some suggested diagrams for your clients. All this work can also be found in my harmonization project template on GitHub. And I understand there's a lot of work that needs to be done, such as unit testing, bug fixing, and clearer documentation, but I hope this project template can be useful by serving as a starting point for those who are doing a similar job as me. I have now reached the end of my presentation, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much. Oh, I thought my background was not going to show. Let me blur a little bit of my background. Thank you so much for sharing your interesting talk about data harmonization. And thank you for sharing as well such great resources in chat. I'd like to open it up for Q&A for anyone who'd like to ask questions of our speaker, Jeremy Selva. So please, anyone who'd like to ask some questions, please go ahead and chat or in the Q&A section.
So there's one question in the Q&A about how do you start a data dictionary?
Well,
do you find people using them?
Well, we tried to start them from a previous project that we have, and we thought maybe it might work for this project. But turns out that when you have so many collaborators with many kinds of variable styles, they will ask you a lot of questions like, hey, this variable doesn't work for me. Can you make some compromises, changes for them? Especially things that are like very broad and very hierarchical in structure, like medication, for example. Like some collaborators will give you very specific drug names, some will give you just very brief names. Some will say, I only know it's these two drugs, but I don't know which one is it. And it becomes very complicated. So in the end, we try to find, we have a very data dictionary that we give to our collaborators, but in the back end, we have a data dictionary that keeps all the buckets for all the different possibilities, but we don't show them to the collaborators, otherwise it would be too overwhelming.
Another great question here about some controlled vocabularies and ontologies here. Wonder whether you tried to use SNOMED CT or LOINC for data harmonization.
No, currently, because I never heard of them actually, but I will take a look at it. And usually I will try to name my data dictionary in a more, I would say more dynamic way, like because we sent one and it didn't work, and then we try to change it in such a way that it works for that particular project, but it's still a learning process for us.
So have you been able to take what you've got and use it across multiple projects? So is it easy to transfer between projects?
Yeah, because we don't want the data dictionary also to be too complicated. If we give our collaborators get a bit overwhelmed. So we send them like a more simplified version. And when they start asking questions or what happened by this case, what happened by that case, at least we are more prepared to give an answer to that.
There's a great comment here. Chat was disabled, but this talk was very helpful. I have been working on this process with our organization over the past year, and it was very nice to see similar approaches being used elsewhere. And another attendee points out that there's another talk coming up at 1:45 with controlled vocabularies point of view. So if thinking about these topics and data harmonization is of interest to you, you may want to attend that talk that's coming up. Well, Jeremy, Selva, thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us about data harmonization. Thank you, speakers and attendees, for sharing your wisdom with us. It sounds like there's lots of people who are going through the same experiences of data harmonization, and we really appreciate your insights. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right, with that, that concludes the session, and we'll see you all in the next one. Bye now.